when the inevitable desire of women to join the community of female mendicants resulted in an appeal led by the Buddha's foster mother, Prajapati, and his ex-wife, Yashodhara. The Buddha refused their request twice, and giving as a reason the difficulty of the society in accepting that same level of freedom for women. Because in the patriarchal family, the women were almost slaves. They were childbearers, they were wives, not by romance, but by family arrangement, and they were mothers. And that was it, And cooks and, cleaners and every kind of occupation like that they did. And to let them go from that sort of oppressive patriarchal family, Buddha knew would be really difficult. So he gave that as a reason, but even so, he was revolutionary enough to, when they pressed the third time their request, he said, okay. And then he added a few more rules for them so that it didn't seem too easy for them, hoping to stem the tide. But actually, he failed to stem the tide because there was basically a kind of stampede of women escaping from the Brahminical society at that time. So this is a very important point to emphasize, because some modern commentators have thought the Buddha was the typical male chauvinist of his era, which he was probably brought up to be as a king and a prince, and with a harem and so forth, But actually, once you become a Buddha, you completely reform your character from the actual subconscious up, by definition, in any form of Buddhism. And so it's impossible, if there is such a thing as Buddhahood, that he would have been male chauvinist. And actually, he himself only gives the reason that the flood of women who will escape the family system, although he doesn't say it like that, but there will be a flood, and this will annoy the patriarchs of the families, that they will lose their cooks, their servants, their gardeners, their child bearers, their pleasure givers, etc. Everything, they will lose it all, and their mothers, and they will resist the community that offers that opportunity to the women. And they did actually do that. But he denies when people say, well, you don't think women can become enlightened? He says, no, they can just as easily become, or more so even, than the males. And the implication, which he doesn't unpack in these individual vehicle teachings, is that the female human form is more naturally altruistic than the male one. And when enlightenment is defined as involving empathy and altruism and non-dual relatedness to others, then you can see that the female is more advanced. Which guy is going to be having a stranger take up residence in his belly for 9 months and then deliver and then not sleep for 6 months while nursing? Which male is about ready to do that, even today, I ask you? So this is unpacked later on in the Buddha's teaching, but it isn't unpacked at the time in detail. But it is implied in his saying this, and his only worry about opening the new educational institution of the community and having the society support it, feed them, give them the free time, and also tame the males, who are the ones who are the fighters, the warriors, they perform violence. So he's focusing on the troublemakers, if you will, in society, which are more the men, like himself. Anyway, so it was hard enough to have the kings give up productive workers, agricultural workers, productive soldiers for their armies, and so forth. And but he was extremely skillful about it, and we have to remember that the Buddha was raised to be a general because, commander-in-chief was the king in those days, and so he knew how to organize large groups of people to do things. And so the community can be understood as a militantly nonviolent core of mendicant brethren to create an educational institution for self-conquest by enlightenment, rather than, and drawing people away from and competing institutionally with the military institution, which was, of course, mainstream in many societies. And even, I think, in our Western society, we are taught that they have to be mainstream, or society is not normal if they don't have a huge military. So the military institution has a focus on developing attitudes and abilities suitable for conquering others, whereas the mendicant community is developing attitudes and skills and abilities for conquering yourself. And in that sense, the Buddha did organize a social revolution, which was individualistic, nonviolent, educational, and gradual, and successful, actually. And demilitarized many societies as it went along, which is why it was hard to see historically, because once they get demilitarized, they get conquered themselves. And this is what I call the cool revolution, which you contrast to a hot revolution in which an oppressed group in a society uses violence to overturn an unbalanced social order. But then you almost always, because they get on top by violence, they simply reproduce the imbalance by being violently dominating themselves. So the hot revolutions don't necessarily help. Whereas the cool revolution changes the actual social attitudes, the sort of general appreciation of the individual and so forth, in a much more effective but slow way. The social function of the Buddhist movement has been totally missed by modern scholars. Not only because Max Weber said that Buddhism was socially apathetic, but also due to the conditioning of modern people in nationalistic societies that causes them to think that there is no alternative to living a life secured by violence, expressed by the elevation of military force. Even in political science, they say that the legitimacy of a government has to do with its monopoly of violence within its territory. So violence is always critical. And the implementation of a militaristic organization of family life through the oppression of women, the harsh discipline of children, etc. Though brought up to be a dominant military royal leader, the Buddha turned his leadership skills in the opposite direction, choosing to organize an army of mendicants to change the inner character of individuals throughout the society, and thereby create a more peaceful, just, and tolerant, if more internationally vulnerable, society. Today's scholars on the other side who study Buddhism, they don't really notice or highlight the fact that the Buddha's own Shakya city-state kingdom was militarily crushed by a neighboring kingdom during his own lifetime, because so many of the young Kshatriya warrior cadets were inspired to the higher lifestyle of mendicancy by the Buddha's teaching, and so the national defenses were weak and vulnerable. This kind of voluntary vulnerability in life choice, I'd rather live peacefully and nonviolently and happily than uptight and violent and maybe a few years longer. In other words, that's the kind of choice. So this is the nature of Buddhist history. And actually it resulted in the conquest of India and most of the rest of Asia, first by Muslim merchants and kings in the latter part of the first millennium, then by European colonialists in the middle of the second millennium, and then now in the 20th century, by the sweep of the communist destruction of the Buddhism-saturated societies throughout Buddhist Asia, and the complete devastation of the virtually unilaterally disarmed Tibetan and Mongolian Buddhist societies.